The latest incarnation of the Traitors TV show first aired in the UK in 2022, and I think it's fair to say that it's really taken the country by storm and has seen other countries also launch their own versions. Viewers just love to see the various psychological strategies the contestants employ and watch the techniques of manipulation being used to varying degrees of success. The original idea for the game was invented by a Russian psychology student, Dmitry Davidov, in 1986, which I guess is why there's so much psychology involved in the game. With me to uncover the psychological techniques within the Traitors, share which tactics they think have worked and which have utterly failed in previous series, and how the game will change with celebrities as contestants are Professor Lisa Oakley, Professor of Safeguarding and Knowledge Exchange in the Division of Psychology at the University of Chester, Dr. Kevin Hochard, Researcher and Specialist in Social and Forensic Psychology at the University of Chester, and Dr. Clea Wright, Senior Lecturer in Investigative and Forensic Psychology with an expertise in deception, trust and group processes, also at the University of Chester. The three of them host the wonderful podcast The Psychology of The Traitors, where they break down each episode of the TV show and discuss the psychology each contestant has used, knowingly or not. If you like the Traitors TV show, I really thoroughly recommend you subscribe to their show. Hello, thank you very much for joining me.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Lisa, I'm going to ask you first, why did three psychologists start a podcast about the Traitors TV show?
I think it came about because so Clea will talk more about her work, but she does lots of work around deception, and she was interviewed by Marie Claire about the programme, so that kind of started us. But basically, the honest answer is that we were having conversations between the three of us about, isn't there a lot of psychology in this, and could we use it in our lectures? We can explain what's going on. It's really exciting and interesting. We can apply psychology, which is kind of a hallmark really of what we do at the University of Chester in psychology. So for us, it was those conversations. And then I think Clea and Kevin had a conversation saying we could record a podcast. And I went in the next day to Clea saying, did you see the episode? We really should do a podcast. And that's really where it came from, was basically three enthusiastic psychologists thinking there's a lot of psychology that applies to this program.
Well, yeah, amazing. And Clea, then, do you use it in your lectures?
I have not specifically used it in my lectures. I haven't used but as kind of anecdotally, I do mention some of the examples. But not all the students have seen it, although it is very, very popular. But there are some great examples of things to do and things not to do.
I've used it in the social psychology lectures, particularly around discourse. So one of the things I use is Harry's speech. I could talk about it later if you want, but there's a particular speech that is a really good example for students of how we construct ideas of things through language and discourse. So I do play them the clip and then get them to have a think about what's actually going on here in terms of language.
And I loved that because I always thought psychology belongs amongst everybody because it's about human behaviour, it's about us, it's how we act, make decisions and choices and what have you. And when academics write papers to other academics that only they can read in sort of journals, it seems a bit odd for psychology. So being able to bring it out to the real world and use examples like that, and then sort of it creates that full circle, doesn't it?
Well, it makes...
And Kevin...
I was just going to say, well, it makes it come alive, doesn't it? If we can use examples that people have seen themselves on the TV or that they can relate to, we're kind of preventing that elitism of psychology, like you're saying, by using that psychological language that other people don't understand. So, we try and make their podcast as accessible as possible to everybody.
Yeah. Kevin, would you describe the Traitors as a psychological experiment?
Yeah, I'm putting my research methods hat on here. Is it strictly an experiment? Are we manipulating something under controlled condition? I suppose, in a way, it is a controlled setting. The variables with the castle, there are some fluctuations, so I suppose they're just iterating on the experiment. The participants will change. And I suppose the rules of the game do change a little bit. But the aim remains the same. So yes, in less less strictly speaking terms, it is an experiment. I find it fascinating because of all the things it highlights. It maybe let's move away from the term experiment. It's maybe more of a naturalistic observational kind of study, and we do see some very strange behaviors.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm trying to be politically correct in some ways.
No, don't. What strange behaviours are you thinking of?
I could go over some strange, but it was something that I thought was very strange, and something that I can't understand why contestants did it in the last season was when contestants were making something up. So, so for example, Leanne pretending to be a nail technician, or who was Charlotte
pretending to be Welsh.
Or Lisa pretending not to be a priest. And I think, they're creating so much unnecessary, what we call cognitive load, but unnecessary thinking and keeping track of things. They're making their own lives very difficult, because as a player, you've got so many things to keep track of anyway, if you're faithful. But
do you think they bring that to the show themselves, or do you think there's an element of the producers kind of maybe pushing them a little bit into these things?
Well, we've talked about this, haven't we? We'd love to know what the producers do and how they select people. What are their selection criteria? I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah.
But I don't think we'll ever know, will we?
That would be a fascinating episode if we could get into the minds of the producers and their selection techniques.
We're really open to talking to them. We'd really like to know. We do have those conversations ourselves quite a lot about how much of this is individual choice and how much is, like you say, is producer choice. I think one of the things that where we started right at the beginning was talking about that one of my favourite bits. We all have different bits that are our favourite, and one of my favourite bits is always the first episode where they meet on the platform.
Yeah,
and that's actually going to be quite different in the celebrity one, which you might go on and talk about. And that's where they do decide how they want to present themselves for the very first time. And as Clea said, Leanne decides she's actually in the army, but she wears pink and she decides to present herself as a nail technician. And as I would say to students, open brackets, here's all the things that she's then trying to portray in that. But we've had some real corkers with that. So there was one person who said they were a team player.
That's right, and then they got called out.
And they were asked, I play teams. What sports do you play? Well, and they couldn't list one. And so there's something about, if you're going to, and we've talked about this on the podcast, but if you're going to create a persona for yourself, then you need to be able to keep that going. And so there's also things that people keep hidden about themselves often because they think they might become too easy a target if people know particular things about them. So that first episode is always one of my favourites, where we see how people choose to introduce themselves. But then, as Clea says, you've got to be able to keep that up if you want to be seen as trustworthy.
Well, one of the biggest things that people look for, and we've seen this a lot in the episodes, is that when people are deciding who they can trust, they look for authenticity and consistency and people being themselves. If somebody's behaviour changes, or they think they're being inconsistent, then they regard that as suspicious. So if you're having to keep track of these lies that you're telling about yourself to start with, as well as trying to keep track of everything else that you have to keep track of, you're kind of making your own life unnecessarily difficult, I think. Although, having said that, I think Leanne and Charlotte both went very far in the last season, didn't they? So maybe it's just, for me, if I was going to do it, I would definitely not make up anything, because I think it would be very difficult to keep track of everything.
Yeah. I can't imagine a producer saying to somebody, we think you should try to be Welsh throughout this.
No.
That sounds like, it sounds like it's come from her herself, which, as you say, is a bizarre thing to do. But then there are things which you think, well, the producers did do this. So way back in series 1, when Tom and Alex were a couple, but hid it until Tom stood up at breakfast and told everyone. And as you said there, Clea, suddenly he's told a lie. And so what else are they hiding? It becomes this, he may have thought this was a sort of appeal of honesty, maybe, but actually everyone else went, hang on a second, this is not right.
There's an interesting kind of strategy that some people seem to be using. At least it's been reported that one of the contestants in the Irish Traitors show is using. It's basically playing dumb and trying to not appear as a threat. So even though they may have a good inkling as to who the traitor might be, they just won't name them. They'll just play dumb. And I think it's that perhaps that Leanne was trying to get at, be underestimated, so that she flies under the radar, keeps her head down, and then she doesn't become a target for assassination straight away.
Yeah. And you talk about cognitive load. I mean, that's a psychological term. It's the idea that really we should try and keep everything as simple as possible. So is the best strategy, you think, to go in and just be yourself?
I think so. Well, I think in terms of cognitive load, it's one of the most important psychological aspects that we think about in credibility assessment. So people often think that the difference between liars and truth tellers might be, nervousness and non-verbal behaviours associated with nervousness. But actually, most researchers agree that one of the biggest differences between liars and truth tellers is cognitive load, so having to think harder. So, if you're lying to somebody, you've got to keep track of all kinds of things. You've got to keep track of what you're saying, that what you're saying fits in with what you've said before or what they know. You have to monitor your own behaviour. You have to keep track of loads of things. So people who are lying have more to think about. They have higher cognitive load. And there are some behaviours that we can see or hear that are related to that. So if people going to the Traitors knew about the research, they would definitely try and minimise their own cognitive load, because we know that liars already have a higher cognitive load. So, you can kind of exploit those differences.
Are there some people who are better at lying, better at, I guess, taking that cognitive load?
Well, there are some people, not in terms of specifically cognitive load, but there's something called demeanour bias, which means that some people just naturally appear more credible and more believable, regardless of whether or not they're telling the truth. And some people naturally appear less credible, more shifty, less trustworthy. So, so it's really unfortunate. So for some people, regardless of whether they're lying or telling the truth, more people will believe them. And for other people, most people will consider them suspicious, irrespective of whether they're lying or telling the truth.
Can you think of any examples in the last 3 series which had that? Either somebody was lying, but everyone felt they were telling the truth, or the opposite?
Well, everybody believed Harry, didn't they?
I was going to say Harry. Yeah.
Everybody believed Harry because he came across as a very trustworthy person, and that's one of the key areas of error in the player's decision making, is that they decide whether or not somebody is trustworthy. And obviously, logically, somebody could be a genuinely really trustworthy person, but for the purposes of the game, they're lying. Because the traitors don't choose themselves, the producer chooses them. So if I was a producer, I would choose somebody who's really trustworthy as a person to be a traitor, because then they're much harder to spot.
Yeah. And obviously Harry went on to win.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's...
So it's a strategy that paid off.
Yeah.
It is, and actually we saw, didn't we, in the final episode, Molly really, really struggling, and was like, because she was absolutely sure that he was what he said he was. And that's why I use that speech. So there's one of the challenges is the swords in the stone, where they have to pull out the swords, and the person who pulls out the short one can take home, I think it's £7,000 there and then. And of course it's Harry that pulls it out. And then he has this beautiful speech, which I play to the students, where he talks about being a team player. And and then he also says to Claudia, "Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you for the offer. But, I'm a team player." And he uses that term team 3 times, and as one of the faithfuls, and he's reinforcing this identity through the language that he has. And then of course, outwardly, he's turning down £7,000. Inwardly, he's thinking, if I get to the end, I'm getting a lot more than that. But this plays into the persona that has been portrayed and the use of language. And that's one thing that I find fascinating is, and I think we often in our conversations is where people are going, 100%, I'm 100% sure of this person. I think you can't be, but once you've determined, and this is why those first impressions are quite significant, because once you've determined who somebody is, can take quite a lot for you to change your mind about that person.
And I guess if somebody was, really honest and acknowledged the parameters of the game, that it is a game, and sort of said, well, it doesn't really matter who we vote off in the first 5 episodes, because if we get a traitor, they're going to vote another one in. So until the end, it doesn't really matter. So who cares? I've got no reason. I'm randomly going to do it. Then actually that becomes really suspicious and people aren't going to like that person.
Well, there was one player, and I can't remember, I think it was last season, but who was very upfront and open about that. And he was saying, but any of us could be lying at any time because it's the game. And he kept saying it's the game. And he was framing everybody's actions in the context of the game. Whereas most of the other players seemed so immersed in what they were doing, they kind of found it difficult to separate that context. And he was regarded as suspicious for saying, well, yes, I could be lying. I could be a traitor. which is true, he could be. And, but the other players found that very hard to accept, and I think he was voted out maybe halfway through.
Yeah, it didn't seem like a good tactic, even though he was perfectly right and rational, almost.
And it's logical, yeah.
Yeah. Why would anyone want to appear in The Traitors? Because you brought it up there that people do take this emotionally. They get really invested in it. And it's just a game.
I think you should talk to Kevin because he wants to be a traitor. Claire and I said we would have to go in as faithfuls, but Kevin wants to go in as a traitor.
I looked at the forms, and then you had to record a video, and I thought, no, I'm just going to end up looking like an idiot. So I left it.
Surely, as a psychologist, it's a lose-lose situation. Because you either say to the camera behind the scenes, I'm a psychologist, doesn't matter what you tell people you are. And so if you then fail, you look like an idiot.
Yeah.
But if you win, you just come across as a smartass. So I think a psychologist in there can never win. It's just a lose situation.
Yes.
I'm just saying, Kevin, it's up to you.
No, that's true. And I think I would rather just sit and comment rather than partake.
Well, didn't we have Yin, who had a PhD in communication?
Yeah, she was all about non-verbal communication.
She was voted out immediately.
Like yeah.
But there again, if we compare to Leanne, who downplayed her skills, she was right up front, and therefore she was the first out. She put a big target on herself. Clea,
I guess, have you noticed any change in how people play The Traitors over time as players have become more accustomed to the format, watched it themselves?
There might be small changes, but overall, I'm more struck by how little the players learn from watching the previous episodes.
Yeah. And the last three people in the breakfast room are always the traitors. That's that sort of thing.
And I don't mean that in a dismissive or derogatory way. I just think that the format is so immersive that we watch every season. People are unable to separate their kind of emotional responses from their logical arguments. And we talk about this quite often when we're watching it, that, every season people will say, oh, I'm absolutely sure this person's trustworthy. I'm 100% sure they're lying or telling the truth. But we've seen from previous episodes that it's impossible and you can't know that. And people decide based on usually their emotional responses to people. If they like someone, they deem them as trustworthy and they decide that they can't be a traitor just because they like someone. Whereas, everybody knows the format. Traitors are selected by the producers and they don't choose themselves. So it could be anybody, but people seem to be remarkably reluctant or unable to accept that.
It's very similar, isn't it, to, I guess, classic psychology experiments, which most people will know if they've done anything in psychology. Robber's Cave, for instance, Sheriff in the 1950s, or the classic Stanford prison experiment, when participants in both of those were known it's an experiment of sorts, and yet get so immersed in it, it changes their behaviour beyond what they would even think possible.
And I think we see that by the emotion, don't we? When people are voted out, we see the emotion. I mean, we talk on the podcast a lot about social identity theory and kind of, the group, because to survive, you've got to be able to form alliances because you've got to have people who are working with you to be able to survive. So you have to enter into a social game. Your social identity is really important for you to be able to survive in that game. But once you start to form those alliances and you build that sense of identity, that we think is part of the reason why people find it hard then to think differently about people, because they've formed those alliances, they've formed those impressions, and then it becomes really difficult. But actually becoming part of an alliance is part of your protection of staying in the game.
What sort of strategies are there that you've seen about alliance forming?
I think definitely the kind of similarity thing. So people thinking, pointing at how they're similar to each other. So we know that in social identity theory that you're more likely to form bonds with people who you think are like you. So in the early days, we see that kind of where people are pointing out how they're similar to each other. And that can be across a whole range of areas where they see themselves as similar. So that's a kind of maybe an early alliance forming is where we see people that we think are similar to ourselves. But also sometimes people are a bit more strategic. strategic, I think, about their alliance forming. So if they feel like somebody is actually, going to be a strong player, or they've already got good alliances, then you might choose to form an alliance with them because you're going to benefit from that if you can. So there are different. I don't know if either of you two have got anything else.
Well, what you said about looking people who are similar, I just remember Harry and Johnny from season 2, I think.
2, yeah.
So Harry and Johnny, and they've both been in the military, and the little where they're shot and they're in the seat, and they're separate and they're interviewed separately. Both of them were talking about each other, calling each other brothers and saying how much they identified with them, and it was that shared military experience that really mattered, and they wanted to protect each other because they'd both been in the military. And Harry felt really, really guilty that he had to, what he felt, betray Johnny in a way, because he was his brother in the military. So it's that kind of shared identity.
They only met the week before or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think, but even though they just met, that, we were talking about how immersive the experience is, and I think it's specifically designed to be immersive, isn't it? So they're removed far away from everybody they know. They don't have any contact with anybody else. They're kind of isolated as a group. They're given all these tasks, which are designed, well, initially in the earlier seasons seemed designed to build that kind of group cohesion and that sense of a group, kind of like, team building exercises. Although I think Kevin, you noticed this, didn't you, in the last season, that some of the tasks seem to have changed a bit and seem to be designed to kind of create division more than group unity.
Yeah. So, well, just before I go on to the tasks, if you've watched the American shows where the participants were selected from older games, they pick people from Survivor and those kind of shows, and people from Real Housewives of I don't know what, and you saw them form cliques based on those shows, and then it became the game players versus the housewives. So it is this, those similarities brought those people together, even though they may have been, particularly the housewives, may have been rivals in the previous shows. They just came together because of that identity. But as far as the tasks, particularly in the later season, some of them are just straight psychological games that are there. The one that struck me the most, and I did mention it in the podcast, it was the dolls where you pull their strings and they say a particular number. It was very creepy, but and you had to decide whether or not they were going to say a higher number or not, or they might just stop. This is a classic risk game called the Balloon Analog Risk Task, the BART, where if it's on a computer, you press a little space bar and you don't know, you just see a balloon just inflating. So it's the same as them pulling that string on the doll, but you don't know when the balloon's going to pop. And if the balloon pops, you lose all the money that you gain with each pump. So every time they pull the string, they're gaining money, and then the doll goes. So it's just a classic. So the producers are clearly reading some studies and getting some inspiration, which is fantastic to see.
And I guess if the producers needed any ideas, they can contact you all at Chester
Of course,
University.
we would love to give them some ideas.
Fantastic.
But it's this fantastic thing that this show does, which is, as Lisa said earlier, it's bringing psychology to the real world. It's putting it out there, and that's a great mission. I mean, that's something that we do try to do at Chester. So
yeah, it's almost something which would be nice if they admitted a little bit, maybe in the after shows, and then they do talk about social identity theory, or they have a psychologist on just giving a little insight, because sometimes it's there, but it isn't named, is it?
No, and it is really interesting, isn't it? Because when you think about the different, I think I'd agree with you, because I think we look at psychology and how do we influence people. So, one of my lectures is called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And that some of the tools that you could normally use, like informational power, they actually have very little usually. They think they have lots, but actually they've got very little to go on. So the key tool is relational power, because it's the relationships that you share with each other. And it's that kind of thing that you could unpick a little bit about why did that actually work, or why didn't that work? And we, one of the things we've talked a little bit about is things like the domino effect, where one person says something and then everybody else kind of follows suit. And you see that at the round table so many times, where somebody brings somebody up and then suddenly everybody joins in. And there's lots of that would be really easy to identify and to talk about. It would be really interesting, I think, and I don't know if they could ever do this, but I'd love to see a version of it, of people who've played the game before going back to play it again. But maybe even more exciting would be if they've done a bit of psychology in the meantime to see whether it does change the gameplay or not. Because it has been interesting to us that the gameplay doesn't change that much. The only thing we think is, one of the things we thought was different is, for example, in the last series, 3 people had to get off the train, didn't they? They had to decide if they were getting off or not. And immediately I said to my husband, I mean, we have all become our partner's biggest nightmares watching this show, because we're like, pause it, I need to write some notes. But I said, those people are going to come back, because we'd seen that in the first. So there's some things like that, but then the game is often really clever at changing. So people think they know what's going to happen, but they don't. And I think that's a really interesting, the unpredictability of it is something that really then keeps people on their toes.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you say about, I guess, being able to study it a little more and you bring it into your lecture halls, it can be really useful to people who are going for job interviews, who are starting new roles, in daily life, to know how to present themselves and to have, I wouldn't call them role models, but you could almost say, right, I need to be a little bit like Harry here, or maybe I'll be a bit like Paul. Maybe not Paul, but still, it could give them sort of that, I can pin an identity and I can just use that as a little role for my own benefit for the time being.
I think people do that to an extent. We all have various kind of facets to ourselves depending on context. There's some things that are more things that we do more readily in one context rather than another. I'm not a particularly great public speaker, but I've trained myself in a lecture hall. I can switch it on. Sure. It's that context dependent kind of skills that pop up. And I do think this show highlights some of this, where at least it lets people perform a little bit. This is where it's going to be very different for this new season with the celebrities, because these are trained professionals. They know how to present themselves. A lot of them are actors or comedians. They know how to, come across well. They know how to be likable. I actually think it's probably going to be harder for some of the sports players. I know there's Joe
Marler?
Marler, that's it. So he's probably used to the pressure of performing on the pitch. Is that going to translate well? Is he going to be able to switch and bring those skills to that context? I don't know.
Clea, how good are humans in general at reading or judging other humans?
Rubbish.
I guess especially under pressure.
Pretty rubbish. Well, in terms of credibility assessment, we've got decades of research suggesting that people are really poor at making accurate credibility judgments. So at deciding whether or not somebody else is lying or telling the truth. The average accuracy is around 54%, which if you think you're deciding if somebody's lying or telling the truth, it's like the toss of a coin, you get half of it right anyway. So we are generally pretty poor at this because we tend to, focus on the wrong things. But in terms of how good we are at reading people in general, not just in terms of credibility assessment, there's something called the illusion of transparency, which means that people in general, we as humans believe that other people can understand our thoughts and our emotions much more than they actually can. So we think that people can read us more than they can. And we see this in the Traitors. We see people who are telling the truth, insisting. They're like, but you have to believe me because I am telling the truth and I am a faithful. And they think just by insisting that they think it's obvious that other people can see what's in their own heads and hearts. But actually, we're not that good at this.
And does that then make it harder for them to lie?
I think it probably makes it easier to lie because people can see it less than we think they can.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the halo effect? We've talked briefly before about if you're a good orator, if you're good at sort of the rhetoric, like Harry was giving his speech, but the halo effect, almost like that charismatic or attractive player, could they get away with more deception?
Well, we know from things like research into jury decision making that there is the halo effect. So, there's it's a small effect, but it is there. The fact that attractive defendants tend to get shorter sentences, and people tend to generally regard people who are attractive or nice, or that we're attracted to in some way, not necessarily sexually, but we're attracted to them as a person. We regard them more positively in all kinds of arenas. So yes, in terms of credibility assessment, probably. There's a small caveat to that, specifically from jury research, is that very attractive females, if it's some kind of fraud case, they tend to be judged more harshly. So yeah.
Why is that?
Well, presumably it's seen as more manipulative, and so in some way more negative.
So the lesson is, if you're going up for trial, watch The Traitors and pick up some tips.
Yeah, or listen to our podcast,
Do that as well, of course, yes. Lisa, as a psychologist, what do you feel is the most important thing for a traitor to do? What should they bring to the show?
Gosh, I think consistency is definitely key. It's picked up on so quickly when people aren't, and it's almost your undoing. It might be a tiny thing, which is actually meaningless, but it breaks open the whole. It's this thing, isn't it, about the persona? Once you've been seen to be untrustworthy in any aspect, the assumption is then you are completely untrustworthy, and that's one of our problems. Is that we say we know that people are not all good or all bad, but we actually see people as one thing, as homogenous, and so as soon as we see them as slightly untrustworthy in one area, then we assume that they are across all different domains, whether that's true or not. So definitely consistency. But I think for me also, that whole thing about being a sociable, likable person is really important if you want to win friends and influence people.
Clear, Kevin. Anything to add to the traitor personality types? Or
I think just to provide an example of what Lisa said in terms of consistency and behaviour change. Do you remember, was it last season we had the sisters?
Oh, yeah.
Maya and... I can't remember. But anyway, the sister...
Was it Armani?
Armani,
yeah.
Yes. So Maya immediately saw that difference in her sister. She said to her something like, why are you using your work voice? Or you've got different energy, and is she being for real? And obviously she knew her sister very well, so she could see those very small differences in consistency that the other players might not have been able to see. But it was that, and then that opened the floodgates. Everyone decided that Armani was not being consistent, but it is that lack of consistency, that small change in behaviour.
And we saw that before, didn't we, with Mother and Son? Were in there, and obviously at the beginning it was Tom and Alex who were a couple, so people who did know each other but hid that knowledge. And is it that they, I guess, can spot when they're not being consistent more than complete strangers can?
They have far more of a frame of reference to be able to spot the inconsistencies, and not just far more, but across more contexts. So they're able to see, okay, I might expect this inconsistency because of the pressure, but I've seen you in those different roles before, and this is where it highlights it.
So that's going to be really interesting going into the celebrities then, isn't it? Because with the celebrities episode, so first episode out on October the 8th, and for those who haven't looked at it or know anything about it, just very quickly I'll rattle through who's in it. It's Nick Mohammed, Joe Marler, David Olusoga, Nico Omalana, Mark Bonner, Jonathan Ross, Joe Wilkinson, Lucy Beaumont, Ruth Codd, Tamika Epson, Celia Imrie, Kat Burns, Charlotte Church, Kate Garraway, Alan Carr, Paloma Faith, Tom Daly, Claire Balding, and National Treasure Stephen Fry.
And there it is. We've used this so many times, National Treasure. We've talked about
put
that.
National Treasure Celia Imrie as well, to be fair, I think.
I think no one's going to be able to murder Stephen Fry, are they? Because there would be a public outcry.
I think the opposite.
I think it's going to be well, because obviously very intelligent people are seen as a threat by the traitors. They always identify intelligent people as a threat. And Stephen Fry is known to be exceptionally intelligent. But how can you murder Stephen Fry? You can't. I think there'll be a national outcry. And I think celebrities, they have to be aware of their public image. They're not just they're doing this for their profile more than to win the money, I'm guessing. So they might be playing in a different way.
But I think, and I've heard maybe Richard Osman talking, who knows quite a lot of the people, saying that they just wanted to do it. I mean, Stephen Fry, I think, was a case in point that he's famous enough. I mean, nobody's not heard of him. He just finds this fascinating and wants to go in there. Yeah. And I think probably the same with Celia Imrie. I mean, she doesn't need to do it.
Well, so none of them need to do it, but I think they will all be aware of their public profile and how the public judge them, because they are all public people. They're celebrities by definition. So I just think it would be really hard to murder Stephen Fry. I think you'd be the most unpopular person in the country.
I would happily do it. Yeah. I would happily do it.
All three of us would.
I could not murder Stephen Fry.
I think he's going to be the first to be out.
Oh, no.
I think he's got that target on him because he's seen as being bright and everything else. He's going to be seen by the if he's not chosen to be a traitor, he's going to be seen to be too much of a detective.
I mean, he
like Jazz
in the
previous
something. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah. So I think they're gonna just narrow in on him and go after him. But and if he is a traitor, then I think everyone's gonna go, he's clever enough to be a traitor and pull it off.
I don't think
he can win.
I think it's a really big psychological and emotional barrier to kill a national treasure.
Well, we'll see. I think one of the things we've talked about that's really interesting is that there is a difference with celebrity traitors in that there are these public personas. So these are not people that we've never seen before. But even within that is something really interesting, isn't it? Because what we know is how these people are represented in the media representations of these people, social constructions of, as Clea said, that the portrayal that is given of different people. What will be really interesting is actually whether that is actually helpful or not to players, because you might actually have an existing relationship with somebody, so you might already know that person. You might not. You might only know their public persona, and then you might have built up your impression, your social construction of what this person is like, and actually that might not be true at all in terms of if you're playing immersively in the day-to-day of the game. So for us, it's going to be really interesting to see whether actually thinking you know somebody is helpful or not, because these are not people that are sisters like we saw in the last series. So there isn't that frame of reference across lots of different contexts, but there is an assumption that you do know something about these people and you know the kind of person they are. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see, does that actually help or not? Do we see things like confirmation bias playing out or not? Are people going to attend to the things that fit with their already decided view of that person? So I think it's going to be a really interesting difference.
I think related to that is that, obviously they're all celebrities, they have a public persona, but I wonder if for some of them there's going to be quite a gap between the celebrity version of themselves and the more private version of themselves. So for example, Alan Carr has got a very big public persona, but I wonder if he's like that 100% of the time, if he's like that off screen. And this might mean, as Lisa was suggesting, that other players who don't know them personally might think they're not being themselves, or they're not being consistent in their behaviour, or, they're behaving oddly. So, and that kind of trait is very important in players deciding whether somebody's a faithful or whether they can trust them. So I wonder if there are going to be some gaps between the public persona and the more kind of off screen. Even though they're on screen, it's hard to maintain that public persona over weeks.
Amongst the groups, there may be friendships that the public may not necessarily be aware of. So, maybe Alan Carr and Stephen Fry are best mates and we don't know. But they've seen each other in enough context that, again, they're going to go, Alan, you're acting suspicious. So we'll find out.
And I suspect a lot of them do know each other personally. Like you say, Stephen Fry probably does know. Maybe Jonathan Ross, would definitely know Nick Mohammed from acting together. And so that they do know their off-screen personas as well a little. Do you think that, I guess that the fact that they might know each other's personas changed the whole game?
It might do.
It might do. I think just from that point of view of you think you know who this person is, and therefore you might call out behaviour that you think is inconsistent. And as Clea said, it's absolutely not inconsistent because actually that isn't their behaviour. So I think for us it's a wait and see, and that's why we're quite excited about this next series of the podcast because it is such a different situation. And we've watched, well, Kevin and I certainly watched the US versions with, as Kevin said, celebrities in, and how that's played out in terms of groups forming and impressions being made and alliances. So it would just be really interesting to see how it plays out within the UK and this version of it. So we're quite excited to see what unfolds.
Yeah. And there are those sort of groups. I try to think and list things because they generally fall into the categories of either what I'd call entertainers, Jonathan Ross, Alan Carr, Kate Garraway, Claire Boulding. They all play themselves. So they're very used to the spotlight, having attention on them, but as themselves. Then you've got the actors, Ruth Codd, Mark Bonner, Tamika Epson, Celia Imrie, Nick Mohammed, who play a character. So we don't really know who Mark Bonner is. We know the characters he's played on television. And that's different, isn't it? And then, as you said at the beginning, we've got the sports people. We've got Joe Marler in there. And we've also got Tom Daly. We've got a couple from the music industry, Paloma Faith, Cat Burns, Charlotte Church. And then one little influencer, Nico Omilana, who's sort of in a category of his own. Do you think those different groups are going to then form, as we saw in other areas, come together? Or may it play out in a different way?
I think some of those that you mentioned actually go across groups because I think what I noticed when I looked at the list was there's a lot of comedians in there. So I'm expecting it to be very funny. I mean, Nick Mohammed is an actor, but he's also a comedian, isn't he? Alan Carr's a presenter, but he's also a comedian. So, yeah, some people are going to have a foot in both camps, aren't they?
I think it might also depend on, as we talked with the other series, it might depend on what they see as similarities between themselves. Some things about life experiences, those kinds of things can build bonds, not just about your social identity and the label you have of what you do as your job, but there's all kinds of other ways in which we connect with people. And so it'll just be interesting to see how those alliances are formed, what is the basis of them. But it's likely to be something shared.
Something that we've seen, I think, in the past, maybe the past 2 seasons, is that kind of the mothering relationships emerging. So kind of a woman who's a generation older than the youngest contestants, turning it as kind of mothering role. And there's been a few relationships, I think, that have involved that kind of, they've become very close, haven't they? So I wonder, I'm just looking at the list now, I'm wondering who will be the mother.
I think a lot will depend on who the big personalities. We already know they're big personalities, but if you compare it to the American one, there were definitely some big characters, and they pulled people to them. I don't think that will necessarily happen here, because it's just not really in the British psyche. We don't like these very over the top characters. We like people that are, it's not going to be as confrontational as the American show, I don't think, because we like to get along. So if there's a breakaway, then that's probably where we're going to see clusters forming, if there's a big character. But otherwise, I think they'll try to all be very collegiate, very friendly with each other. And so maybe it'll make for more of a backstabbing kind of show. I don't know. Here's my hope.
This is why Kevin wants to be a traitor.
But I don't see Stephen Fry as being this rebel-rousing person. I think he's going to be the very kind of calm and everything else. And similarly, the one that I'm on the lookout for is Ruth Codd. My wife is particularly obsessed with her Instagram. So if you've ever seen that, she's quite of a personality there. So I think that's the one that I'm on the lookout for. Maybe a dark horse.
Okay.
One of the things you talk about in your podcast a lot is leadership, whether people take on leadership as a strategy or whether they find themselves in a leadership role by almost mistake. Looking at the people in the celebrities, do you feel that any are going to sort of become the leaders or take on leadership roles for any reason?
It's a hard one. I feel like I don't know a lot of them well enough to be able to say that. You might be able to say, you know, for example, Paloma Faith is I've heard her interviewed and she comes across as very outspoken, very happy to speak her mind. But we just don't know what they're going to be like, do we?
Maybe put it in a different way. What do we look for in a leader?
I think one of the things that Kevin's talked about is really key, and we said this when we've reviewed the previous series, is about the context. So we know from psychology that what makes you a good leader in one situation may not make you a good leader in another. So the context is really important. So you might be really great at leading tasks, say a physical task, if you're a sports player, but you might not be so great at leading another task. So I think the context is going to be important in terms of who's a good leader. I also think we know from psychology there's different ways to influence people. And so, as I said before, often what we see in Traitors is relational influence, but there's all different kinds of ways. And I think we will see a lot of influence through the way language is spoken and the way that we choose to try and influence somebody's thinking. I don't know that it will be as overt, but we can very carefully phrase things, and that will change how somebody perceives something. Even the way, so I've been watching a different show. I've been watching The Inheritance, which is supposed to be the answer to The Traitors. It's very different, but the language that is used to report back on how other people have done in that show changes how people think about what's happened. And so I think language is going to be really key here. And I think actually maybe people who are articulate may become really good leaders because they're able to influence people. But I do think some of it would be dependent on the context. And I do think, as we've said, we don't know how people are going to respond to this immersive nature of this experience.
It reminds me, going back to my undergrad when I did philosophy as well, that in Plato's Gorgias, it talks about Gorgias coming to town and Socrates is having a conversation about what is good and what is just, as he always does. And Gorgias was saying an orator will always be the best person in the forum. They can stand up in the forum to try and get the boat building contract and stand up against a boat builder, and they will win. The orator will always win.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of goes along with what you're saying, Lisa, isn't it? That skill in being able to use language in that way can convince and cajole and manipulate those around them.
I think the one thing I'd say about that is, though, the moment that even a really good orator is found to have told an untruth, then their ability with language will then be seen as manipulation and, untruth, because it's so I think you've got to have some things working together. You've got to have consistency of actions and a good ability to speak and influence. And because once anything starts to fall apart, everything is then seen differently. Well, you would say that, wouldn't you? And we've seen so many times at the round table where people say, that's just what a traitor would say. That's just what a traitor would say, and you think, well, it says somebody's saying, I'm a faithful, I'm 100%. That's just what a traitor would say. And we're all sitting there going, yeah, but it's just what a faithful would say as well. But once you've changed it, it then becomes, I suppose, what we talked about a little bit in some of our shows is that confirmation bias. Oh, well, there you go. That gives me even more. I'm even more sure now that they're not telling the truth. So I think some of the things going together are really important. And I think because the game changes, I think I saw, and forgive me if this is not an accurate quote, but something from Claudia saying the game doesn't care who you are. And I think if things change in the game, the rules of what makes you successful might change, and your ability to adapt, which we know psychologically is so key, your ability to adapt in the moment in the game could be one of the testing points for whether you continue to survive or not.
And that's really important. We don't actually know which rules are going to be in play. We don't know if the seer is coming back, because that totally changed the dynamics in the last season. So yeah, the flexibility, the ability to adapt, yeah, absolutely vital.
Yeah. You mentioned it earlier, I'm just going to go back to it, the roles people have, their public roles, and the persona that they put out as part of that versus who they really are. And then combining that with people might know who they really are, who are in the game with them. So I'm thinking particularly of Joe Wilkinson and Lucy Beaumont. Both of them have a sort of screen persona as a bit dumb, a bit don't care about things, a bit dizzy, which you could argue would do them well because no one really votes off a non-threat if they pretend to go, well, I don't care, I don't know what's going on, explain that to me again, and whatever it might be. But those two definitely know each other. Jonathan Ross knows them both, so they'll know the Joe and the Lucy. That's in the background, and how clever they probably really are to be able to put that persona out there. Do you think there's going to be that cross-pollination of people calling that out and saying Lucy isn't what she says she is?
It's possible, or they'll form a clique and try and fly under the radar. I imagine that actually the comedians will do rather well because they have that ability. They're used to being in front of in the public eye. They are quite good with language. If they're having to craft jokes all the time, they'll have a dexterity with language. And yeah, if that persona is known more widely to just be a bit dumb or aloof, like Joe Wilkinson tends to portray, then I think it would be safe because there's a particularly at the start there's the safety in numbers. You want to be able to affect the change and vote at the round table, so you're going to need your allies, and I can imagine the people that do know each other well in real life, they're going to cluster together because that's their marker of trust. Oh, I know I can trust Joe because I know what he's like. I'd be able to, they'll probably fool themselves thinking I would be able to tell if Joe was lying because I know him from this other context. Again, probably totally fooling themselves, but who knows? So I can imagine those kind of clusters forming in the early game.
Okay. Well, let's make some predictions. Let's start doing that. For each of you, if you were the producers, who would you make a traitor?
Who would I make a traitor? Well, and this is probably not, this isn't an academic thing for me. This is just because I would love to see it. I would like Alan Carr and Stephen Fry to both be traitors because I think it could be absolute carnage. So if I was a producer, I think they might be. But I think Claire Balding could be a great traitor. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, I'd like, if I was a producer, I'd like to mix it up a bit, and see. Also, if I was a producer, I might want to put people from different industries together and people that don't know each other together. But then there's an argument, as we've said, for putting people who do. So, but yeah, definitely for me, I think just because I think it would be really exciting to see all those three in the tower together.
Yeah, as a viewer, that's what you want.
Yeah, that's what I want. Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin, would you agree, or would you choose somebody different?
I would choose someone different. If I was a producer, I'd pick people who come across as very nice and understated. I'm not that great with celebrities, so I'm going off very old knowledge probably. But I think Tom Daly's always come across pretty well in interviews as a nice guy. Charlotte Church, I think, has always been kind of nice and pleasant. So I could imagine, and I think they'll fly under the radar for ages. People won't suspect them.
Yeah. Clear, what about you?
I was also thinking about Charlotte Church, but I think only because didn't she used to be known as an angel, have the voice of an angel or something?
Yeah.
So just for that reason, I think I would pick Charlotte Church, and she's got a very pleasant public persona. I think I might choose somebody like Kate Garraway, because when I think of Kate Garraway, I immediately think safe pair of hands. So I think people would. She's got that demeanour, hasn't she? That kind of trustworthy, capable, competent demeanour that I think people would find subconsciously trustworthy. So, yeah, I think the safe pair of hands and the angel would be a good starting place.
Yeah, makes sense.
And herein lies the difference between us, you see, because my approach is just let's put 3 people in who are completely different and see what happens. But I can see the point for, people who we assume to be trustworthy. But then the caveat to that is some of them know each other and they might see different personas in each other. I'm not saying they wouldn't say they were trustworthy, but they might not think they are reticent or, the things that we think they are. So
who would you choose?
Yeah.
Well, I feel the producers are want to be careful. They don't really want a traitor to be found in episode 1. It's not great for the show. So they won't put, for me, I don't think they will put Stephen Fry in. Sorry, Lisa.
Sadly.
Only because I think they suspect he's going to go first because of that intelligence bias that we talked about. I think Claire Balding, for the same reason, people view her as a very clever, articulate woman, and therefore she could be a threat. Therefore she could go early. Don't put her as a traitor, even though she'd be great as one. I would go more, like say, nice, under the radar. So I would probably put Celia Imrie in there. I would put Kat Burns in there. Again, young, contrasting. And I'd probably put Jo Wilkinson in there just to throw a spanner in the works and a wild card to make everything go strange. Who will be the first to be out? Who's the first to be banished?
I think everyone's going to say Stephen Fry, aren't they? But I still hold firm that you cannot murder a national treasure. I don't think it can happen.
I almost want to speak to you next week to console you when he's gone.
I will be inconsolable. So,
if he wins, of course, you can come back and tell me. What did you know?
What I would say is, Paul, that in the series where Harry won, Clea and Kevin called that quite early. And were like, Harry's going to win. And I didn't agree. So the chances of my version of who's going to be the traitors being high is not great. But theirs might be better than mine. But definitely they called Harry. So we'll see.
Maybe David Olusoga. He's an academic, isn't he?
Yes, he's a historian.
So I think he'll be seen as very intelligent. So he might be got rid of early on because, people might see him as threatening for his intelligence. Possibly.
Kevin, who's the first to go for you?
I think it's between Claire Balding and Stephen Fry. Yeah.
Because of the intelligence threat again.
Yeah, I think they're just going to be, unless they manage to just do a charm offensive in the first episode, which is going to be easy for them because they can, but it's going to be if they make enough of those connections to have that solid kind of clique to defend themselves against a vote, and then I think they'll survive. But otherwise, their days are numbered.
Okay, final question. The big one, who's going to win? Lisa, who's going to win for you? Who's your favourite?
Oh.
Well, not your favourite, I suppose. Who do you think actually is going to play the strategies and the tactics best to come out winner?
Tom Daley. I reckon he could. I think he could do it because I think he could fly under the radar. I think he is very likeable. Yeah, I'm going to go Tom at the moment, but come back to us because as soon as we've seen the first episode, all of this is going to change.
Of course. Clea, who's your winner?
I have absolutely no idea because we haven't seen them yet. I would like to think maybe Lucy Beaumont, maybe even Jonathan Ross.
I nearly went Jonathan Ross. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Kevin, go on.
I think Alan Carr can actually go quite far, just because he's very personable. And if I don't say this, I'll get an earful at home. Ruth Codd.
Yeah. Okay, you've got a double vote. And I am aware that, Lisa, your predictions haven't been as good, but I'm going with yours. I'm Tom Daley as well. I think exactly the same reasons.
Thank you, Paul. It's nice to be amongst friends.
Yeah. Exactly. I'm with your group and we'll see how we get on. So we talked about the celebrities and we talked about the public versions as well. Do you think the psychology of the traitors would change if the players were all children, under 12?
Oh, what a question.
That's really interesting. I mean, from a developmental psychology point of view, yes, because children are in different stages of development. Under 12, it would depend how under 12 they are, at what stage they would be in. So, if they were quite sort of coming into primary school, then there'd be concrete thinkers, so it would be what they can see rather than what's going on. And so there's lots of ways in which it would be different. It's also, at a very young age, one of the things we talked about before is you think that everybody thinks the way you do and can see. So if you're lying, people will know. Until you get theory of mind, you don't know that that's going to be different. So it depends what ages of children you're putting in. But yeah, it would be different. And I think it would be really, really interesting, although the ethics of it might also be challenging.
Don't think it would be as good a show because the oratory element that can save people, I don't think it would be as developed. And I think so. I think the roundtables would not be it would just be well, he said this, he said that, and it just wouldn't come across as nicely. So I think it would be much more of a popularity contest than anything else. Agreed.
I think in terms of, we touched on earlier about how people might make decisions, and people often rely on who they like, and I think that kind of really rational, logical decision making would be less developed in children. And so I think even more, as Kevin says, it will turn out to be a popularity contest, and people will just vote for who they like and try to get rid of people that they don't like so much.
And one of the things we do know, because we did have Ivan from the first series on our podcast, and he was talking about just the amount of support there is for psychological well-being on the show, and how much there is behind. That was one of my interests. How are people kept safe through the process, especially those that are not known to the public and then suddenly become people that everybody thinks they can comment on. And there's a lot of behind the scenes support, and so I don't think you'll ever see a children's Traitors, because I'm not sure how you would make that a safe process for a child to engage in. But there might be all kinds of different ways you could change the show.
Of course. I'm interested, if it's a series which requires psychological safety and people on the team to look after people, then he questions its sort of ethical side altogether, really, even for adults. And as you say, the way that the general public can get thrust into the spotlight, and not necessarily in a good way. So I'm thinking Kieran, for instance, after his parting gift, you got a lot of press written about it, and there was YouTube videos talking about how that shouldn't be allowed and what have you. Is it an ethical programme overall?
I think that would apply more generally to any kind of reality TV type program or any kind of game show, and I think that's a very big question, isn't it? And I think the only thing you could say mitigation is that people are doing this voluntarily, and they know what they're getting into, and presumably they're doing it to get something out of it. They expect some kind of benefit, but I think we've become a lot more aware over the past few years about the support that people might need and the risks of taking part in these kinds of programs.
And I think one of the good things is that there's being responsive or being proactive, isn't there? And it seems to us there's a lot of proactive work going on. We don't know about it in detail, but and I think that's a really positive thing, that people are beginning to think about psychological well-being and planning for how to support people rather than waiting until somebody needs that support. So that's another way to think about this, is actually building in considerations of psychological well-being, and that goes well beyond this show. It's not even about shows; it's about things generally. How do we think about ahead the impact of anything on somebody's psychological well-being, and how we might be able to support that?
That's a really positive way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of it like that. And I imagine then, if any of the producers of The Traitors wishes to talk about that on your show, you would welcome them on.
Definitely.
Oh, yes.
There you go. If you're listening, get in contact. I'll put all your details in the show notes so anyone can get in contact with you.
Thank you.
I'm just interested to finish. People are going to be watching the show over the coming weeks and following or subsequent series as well. Could you each pick one psychological strategy that viewers can watch out for when they're watching the show that you think is going to come up, and they can spot it and go, I heard that on the podcast? Clea, what do you think would be something that people should watch out for?
I think confirmation bias is a really big one. So confirmation bias is where we we incorporate information that we get into ideas that we already have. So basically, we interpret new information in a way that fits in with our existing beliefs. So we get a piece of information, and if you think somebody's faithful already, you'll interpret that piece of information as more evidence that that person is a faithful. Or conversely, if you think they're a traitor, you'll think, well, yeah, that proves they're a traitor. That's exactly what a traitor would say, that kind of thing. So I think you will see quite a lot of that confirmation bias that people, and we do this in all areas of life, not just in terms of watching the Traitors, but all of us do it all the time, that we fit what we see into what we already believe and what we already think.
Yeah. I remember watching the American first series, I think, of Brandy. And Brandy, at the very start, said, I can read people. I'm very good at this. Michael is a traitor. And she just kept everything Michael said. She ignored the things which was pretty much showing that he was a faithful, of which he was, and picked up on anything which just proved her hypothesis, really, and just ignored everything else.
Yeah.
And ultimately was proving wrong when she was voted out.
Yeah, I think we'll see a lot of that.
Kevin, what do you think?
Social influence tends to work well through networks. So I am going to say, look out for that individual that is connected, that has those relationships across different cliques, because they're going to be very powerful at influencing group decisions. So actually, if you're going to play, be that person as much as possible, because you'll have the most sway. That would have been my strategy had I been on the show. There we go. I've given my trade secrets away.
There's still future series for you to put your application in, Kevin. We know that you want to be on it. Lisa, finally with you.
I've probably said similar to what Claire and Kevin had said as a kind of two things. I think the other thing for me is just watch out for people's use of language, the terminology they use, the phrases that they use. What are they trying to construct in people's minds by the language that they're using? And I think that is a really real key. And if you actually go back and watch series and you look at people's use of language, you can see people are constructing themselves as a team player, as a faithful, as trustworthy in the way in which they speak about anything. So I think just, become that sort of annoying psychologist where you pause the program because you're like, oh, did you hear what they just said? This is what they're trying to do there. So I think use of language is the thing for me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining me. For the listeners, make sure you tune into Clea, Lisa and Kevin's podcast on Spotify, The Psychology of the Traitors, where they will be analysing every episode of the new series of the Celebrity Traitors. And you'll also see in there episodes on things such as the psychology of attraction, psychology of sleep, music, and much more as well. So I fully recommend going over and checking out their podcast. I'll also put links to each of their university profiles in the show notes if you'd like to find out more about their research. Well, I hope we've armed you for the psychological tricks and strategies that you're going to see play out over the coming weeks. Let's see if any of our predictions play out. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.